Good evening. It is wonderful to be with you all this evening. My name is Alex Dye. I'm the lead pastor at Oak Grove Mennonite Church in West Liberty, Ohio, and on behalf of the Missional Resource Team, I would like to welcome you to our missional conference for the next 2 days called Come and See the Mission of the Church in God's Country. The missional conference team, which consists of myself and some others that'll join us along the way, Jacob Dodson, Corbin Beauchard, Alyssa Short, and the presenter, Brad Roth, are so excited that you have decided to join us for the next couple of days for this conversation on the way that God is working in the lives of the church, wherever she may be planted, but especially in rural contexts, which we know many, if not most of you, are in that. Thank you for taking the precious evening time out of your Thursday and Friday nights to spend in front of the computer, as you've probably already spent a lot of the day in front of the computer. My friend made a joke about how we spend all day in front of medium-sized screens so we can go home and sit in front of big screens and look at our little screens. So thank you for taking the time to do that. It's our prayer that God will spark your imagination in new and exciting ways to approach mission in your neighborhoods, and that God will renew a love in you for the places, the neighborhoods that you have been planted and called. For a call to worship this evening, I'm going to be reading from Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 38. And I really wanted to jumpstart our minds with some scripture that is missional in nature and also uses some rural imagery to make its point. So Matthew 9, 35 through 38. And Jesus went throughout all of the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." The word of the Lord. Now turn it over to one of my missional research team colleagues to continue in this opening session.
Thank you, Alex. Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob Dodson, pastor at Worcester Mennonite Church, and I have the pleasure of sharing with you a little bit of background of how this particular conference came to be. In late 2016, when we first started planning and thinking about what a year of mission could be in our conference, and we started thinking and planning about hosting our first missional conference, our vision back then was just to introduce missional concepts and models and ideas to the conference. And we did that. We invited Lance Ford and Brad Briscoe, and then we did more planning, and eventually we invited Alan and Deborah Hirsch, and that was very exciting. It was a chance to, in some cases, drink from the fire hose. We learned so much about missional thinking and new ways of being church. But one of the resounding questions that kept coming up for us at the time was, well, what does this mean specifically for Anabaptists? How do we be missional as Anabaptists? And what does this mean in rural contexts? Because most of the examples that we were given were from urban contexts. So we worked at the Anabaptist question when we had our conference in Bluffton with Marvin Lorenzana and Megan Good. But we kept wanting to come back to this question about mission in rural contexts. We had the idea of reaching out to our guest speaker, Brad, back then, but at the time, scheduling, it would take a while to finally find a date that would work, so we had an intervening conference in between, but we're so happy that it's finally worked out this year that we could come back to that question that we wanted to look at for so long. What does it mean to be missional in rural contexts? And so that's just a little survey of where we've been over the past few years, and it's a real joy to continue on this journey with you. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Well, my name is Corbin Weaver Bushard. I'm another member of the Missional Resource Team, and just want to share a little bit about some of what we're looking forward to as a resource team. We've been at work planning these meetings, overseeing things like the Missional Discipleship Initiative and Ohio Conference, the Sent Network. And as we've been talking about this particular conference with Brad, who's written, I think we can say extensively now on God's mission in the rural church, one of the themes that we've been talking about is just the fact that we're excited for the opportunity to say we see rural churches in the midst of this missional conversation. We hear rural churches in the midst of this conversation, and as a conference, we're also together on this journey. And where we had the most energy, I felt like, when we were just dreaming about what we might cover this weekend, there's just excitement about what rural churches have to offer the conversation when we talk about God's mission and what it means to be missional. We know that God is every bit as present in rural communities as God is present in urban communities. I'm the product of a rural church, and I know how profoundly I was shaped in my own faith in a rural setting. And all 4 or 5 of us on the missional resource team were able to reflect our excitement at what we see rural churches having to offer, and just our excitement at further exploring that together as a conference. So we're excited to hear fresh ideas from Brad, but also to discuss together to see where this conversation leads us as a whole conference. We're excited to dialogue alongside our urban brothers and sisters, recognizing that a lot of the principles that Brad is going to be talking about, they're universal. This is all about how God is at work in the world and in the rural church, but also in urban settings as well. So we hope that you have your thinking hats on, your dreaming hats on, to catch new visions and inspirations this week. I think that's what we're most looking forward to. So that said, I'll hand it over to Alyssa, and she can introduce Brad and bless our evening together.
Yes, like it's been stated many times, we are very excited to have Brad Roth here with us for the next few days. We've been waiting a long time for this, like Jacob mentioned. And so now I have the great pleasure of introducing Brad Roth to you. Brad is serving as pastor at West Zion Mennonite Church in rural Moundridge, Kansas. And he has a lot of experience in what he's going to be talking about, as he grew up baling hay, tending sheep, and shearing Christmas trees on a farm in Illinois. He also brings a lot of education with him. He is a graduate of Augustana College, Harvard Divinity School, and Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. Brad has a heart for serving God and God's people in rural communities, and he's passionate about sharing his faith in word and deed and living out God's love in the community. He and his wife, Lisi, they enjoy bicycling, tending a garden, keeping chickens, and playing with their 3 sons. Brad blogs on seeing God in the everyday at doxologyproject.com. And his book, which we hope you'll check out, entitled God's Country, Faith, Hope, and the Future of the Rural Church, was published by Herald Press, and it won an Award of Merit in Christianity Today's 2018 Book Awards. Brad also has a book on the meaning of communion that will be coming out this fall, and he's working on his second book on the rural church for the Lexham Ministry Guides series for the fall of 2022. So as we welcome Brad to this conference, I invite you now to pray with me. Father God, we invite you here tonight as we gather to learn more about you and about your church. Rain down your spirit, open our eyes, our ears, and our minds. Help us to hear the words that you have given to Brad. May the fullness of your spirit dwell in Brad. We pray for clarity, for boldness and grace as he shares his message with us. Lord, we praise you for the way that you have worked in each of our lives, the way that you have brought each one of us here this evening. Bless us, Lord, we ask. Fill our hearts with your desires and help us to grow in your knowledge. Calm right now Brad's heart, calm his thoughts, and use him as your vessel. We ask all of these things in thy name. Amen.
Well, hello, Buckeye State. Greetings from the Wheat State, and greetings to friends and brothers and sisters who are in other places. I think we have a few folks joining us from Illinois and Indiana and maybe Pennsylvania. I'm not sure if there's other folks, but so glad to be here. I'm coming to you live from Moundridge, Kansas, which is a rural community of about 1,800 people. And if you know Heston, we are about 10 minutes north of Heston. But I am so grateful to be able to join you this evening and tomorrow evening. And on Saturday, I've been holding all of you and this conference before God in prayer during this time. My hope is that each one who is attending this will really receive some gift from God, something that you need to hear for your life and ministry. Like Alyssa mentioned, I'm married. I've got 3 sons, a 16-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 2-year-old. So we are in teen times 2 and also the terrible 2s. So we're learning to drive and potty training at the same time. It gets kind of interesting at our house. And I grew up in Illinois on a farm in a small community. And like a lot of young people, I hit the road for college and pretty much never came back, right? It was just onward from there. I went to study in Boston, got married. My wife is a big city girl, and so I've kind of been easing her down into smaller and smaller communities. Like we've been moving across the country each time to a smaller community. And now I serve as the pastor at the Westside Mennonite Church in Moundridge. We're a small church. Like pre-COVID, we were 70 to 75 people. And now I think it's anybody's guess, right? I saw a Barna study the other day. Maybe some of you are familiar with Barna, but saying like 1 in 3 people are connecting to their same church, maybe over Zoom or now in person. 1 in 3 people are going to a different church now, and another third is not going anywhere at all. So it's kind of this question, like Heston College brought up last week at a conference they had. What if they don't come back, right? We're sort of trying to figure this out as we move through this. And the book that I wrote that Alyssa mentioned was published in 2017, God's Country, Faith, Hope, and the Future of the Rural Church. And one of the things that this book has done, in writing it and then after it's come out, is giving me a chance to connect with folks from a variety of congregations in various settings. And, we've got like Assemblies of God folks, and Catholic folks, and all kinds of people in between, Mennonites and Methodists and Lutherans. And it's really, what I think has been beautiful for me about that is that we all seem to be speaking the same language. We're all facing the same sorts of challenges, like population decline in some places, or aging communities and congregations, sometimes economic difficulties in rural communities, especially with the great fluctuation in commodity prices, but we're also all experiencing many of the same possibilities. And for me, it just points to the commonalities that we share across the board as the rural church, that we're all called to really live out the gospel and preach and embody the gospel wherever we're at. And I've been working on that book that Alyssa mentioned for the Lexham Ministry Guide series. And that's kind of given me a chance to talk to more folks. So, you're really getting my cutting edge stuff here. But that said, I do not have it all figured out. You can ask my congregation or ask my wife. And I keep having these moments where I think like, I think I know what's going on, but it's not exactly what I imagined. If you've read the book Gilead, which is a wonderful book that really focuses on a rural church in Iowa and a rural pastor, there's a character name in there. Her name is Glory Boughton, and she has this encounter. It's a scene where she finds her brother's little child playing with her mother in the river, and she thinks it's going to be a tragic scene. But as she observes it, she realizes that there's more depth there. And she says, "I do not understand one thing in this world, not one." And I feel like that quite a lot. And I just really keep trying to write beautiful words about how I do not have it figured out. So this is not going to be your 10 points to grow your rural congregation. It's nothing like that. But Jesus just keeps showing up in our little church. I keep tracking down stories of how Jesus is showing up in other people's congregations. And I just keep circling back to what he's doing, which is beautiful. And what I've been doing in the last couple of years is talking to rural pastors and leaders around the country, reflecting on scripture and the classic teachings of the church, and also reflecting on my own ministry. And when I say reflect on my own ministry, what I really mean by that is that I look at the times where I have messed up, made a mistake, and I try to learn something from that. It means that I have a lot of material. And I should also say this, that while my context is rural, I love how Corbin kind of made this point too, and I think rural really gets less attention. Sometimes it's considered less appealing or something less hip, whatever. But I want to draw attention to rural and just pull that out. We're going to really start from rural. But I think that there's a lot that we're going to talk about that can be carried over into other settings. And the last thing I want to do too, as we talk about rural, is to somehow demean other settings like suburban or urban. I mean, I think wherever you're at, we're starting with rural, but wherever you're at, I'm just thrilled for God to be at work in your particular setting. And I hope that you can hear something that you can carry into your place, wherever you're at. And so at the same time, I also want to just give you a word or two about where I hope to go today. This is the way we'll put this together. I'm going to talk for a while, but there also will be a few places for questions and for discussion. We're going to pause twice for 5 minutes each, and there will be a time for you to gather with a small group through Zoom. And we're also going to do a couple of Zoom surveys along the way. And my hope is that will allow everybody to stay engaged, and we can find spaces that work for both introverts and extroverts, and everybody can join the conversation. And I just want to recognize too that right now, being in the rural church, being in a small church, in rural church ministry, it may be one of the hardest things that we've got going. I mean, partly it's the strain of COVID, but I also think that the general election and the tense atmosphere that is played into there being a lot of stress. And when I've talked to rural church leaders, I keep hearing that same thing. Like, people are saying, I'm just done. I'm just going to get out. People are tired. People are feeling kind of burnt out. They're burning the candles from both ends. And so I hope you hear something encouraging right now. I know it is tough. There is a lot of hard stuff that's happened and that is happening, but I hope you hear something encouraging right now. So I want to just center us too in a passage of scripture. So throughout the weekend, we're really going to be referring back to John chapter 1, and we'll read verses 35 down roughly to 51. We'll kind of use that passage as our touch point throughout the weekend, and you might meditate on that scripture as you have a chance, after we close out and maybe tomorrow. I want to read just verses 35 to 42 to get us set up right now. This is John 1, 35 to 42. The next day, John the Baptist, the next day, John again was standing with two of his disciples. And as he watched Jesus walk by, he exclaimed, "Look, here is the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. When Jesus turned and saw them following, he said to them, "What are you looking for?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which translated means teacher, "where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come and see." And they came and saw where he was staying, and they remained with him that day. It was about 4:00 in the afternoon. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated anointed. And he brought Simon to Jesus, who looked at him and said, You are Simon, son of John. You are to be called Cephas, which is translated Peter. So imagine this scene. John the Baptist has been the guy who is preparing the way of the Lord. And we'll circle back to this in the sermon on Saturday. He has some disciples, people that want to go deep with him. And Jesus walks by, and two of those disciples respond to John identifying Jesus as the Messiah, the Lamb of God who's going to take away the sins of the world. And they start following him. And they don't say anything to Jesus. They're just walking behind him. But notice what happens then. Jesus turns and saw them following him. This is verse 38. And he says, "What are you looking for?" And I really want to take that as part of our entree into this evening, because I think this is a central question. What are you looking for? Right? And it's a question that is really a life question, but it's also a question, I think, that leads us into rural ministry, because what do we expect to find? What do we think rural ministry is all about? What do we think is the mission of the rural church? And the second piece to this, Jesus asks that question. They put a question to him. Look at verse 39. Then Jesus says to them, "Come and see," right? And I think that's the second piece of this, that Jesus is inviting us to see our context with fresh eyes, to see the places that he is at work, and to notice the beautiful contours of rural communities and congregations where we are serving. So I hope you hear those questions as we are led into this evening. And I just want to check, are you seeing my PowerPoint somewhere right now? Can somebody give me a nod that you are seeing that? You're not seeing that. Okay, so I'm just going to call out to Lynn. There we go. Thank you. All right, that's what I was hoping for. All right, so two questions that I think about as we start this evening. Two questions I think about. The first, these are two questions that are really in front of me when I first began in the rural church, and I served a congregation in Washington State and plopped down in the pastor's study. And I plopped down in the pastor's study and was there, and I was kind of like, all right, first off, where am I and what am I supposed to be doing here? And maybe those are some questions that you're wondering about too. You know, okay. We're getting it worked out here, folks. So we'll talk a little bit about this first question right now in this first session, and then I'm going to pick up this second question. The first one is, where am I? Right? And I remember feeling that pretty distinctly, like, what is this place? Like, where exactly am I? What is going on here? But then the second question, well, then what am I supposed to be doing? And I want to think about this a little bit, because I think those are two central questions. And this question of where am I? You know, authentic ministry, I'm convinced, begins and ends in love of place and in respect for the unique contours of a place. So Wendell Berry, the great agrarian writer, he talks about developing a respectable agriculture. And for him, what that means is learning to think, and he says this, competently and kindly about lands of all sorts, right? So you don't try to plant wheat if you've got dry, rocky soil. If you've got dry, rocky soil, you run cattle, right? If you've got, rich, well-watered soil, you plant corn or whatever it is, right? You got to learn how to tend to the land that you're facing. And I wonder if we could borrow a page from Wendell Berry and swap out the idea of land for churches in order to develop a vision for church that attends to the physical and cultural geography of a place, that really learns to see its culture. So, where are we? Rural versus urban versus suburban. And then to break that down even to the more granular level, rural Ohio is going to look different from rural Kansas. right? And industry and agriculture will be very different in those communities. And I'm guessing that it depends a lot on where you are at in rural Ohio, right? So you've got a lot more major cities than we do in a state like Kansas. You know, Kansas is pretty rural all around. But within Ohio, are you looking at an Appalachian region? Or are you in the north, right? And populations have moved around as economies shift. So some communities are losing population as oil booms or as industry shift happens. Of course, we talk about Ohio sometimes as the Rust Belt, right? So how does that boom and bust cycle impact the way that a church understands itself? So where are you? And that will shape how you do ministry. No great insight there, but I think it's just the basic question of trying to see where you're at. Now, before we came to Kansas, we were serving in the country of Peru. We were up in the mountains out on the edge of the city of Cusco, and we would interact with the Mennonite congregations, which are in really rural communities. And I remember in one of my first experiences out in one of these communities, we had this weekend of preaching and teaching, and it grew late into the night, and we were teaching and praising God together. And after that was kind of all wrapped up, and I did my thing, and some of the other pastors did their thing, the people all stood up in this little church and slid these rickety pews off to the sides of the wall. And they turned to me and they said, "Pastor, now it is time to dance." Now, I don't know about your kind of Mennonites in Ohio, but my kind of Mennonites, we don't dance, right? So this is something totally new to me. But that was their context. That was what they did. So this is the first question. Where am I? Right? We got to figure that out. And we're going to move to a breakout session here in just a moment. And so the question I want to put to you is, what is your community? And we're only going to have 5 minutes in this breakout session, so that means you won't get much time. The good thing is that you will be with the same people in each of the sessions. I think we're doing the same people throughout the entire evening. And so the question I want to put to you is this: what is your community, and how would you define your community, and why? So are you rural? Are you urban? Are you suburban? Or are you something else? Or even just, is that a useful question for you to think about in your community, right? So you're just gonna have 5 minutes, maybe say your name and where you're at, and then just share a little bit, where are you at and how would you define your community? So if Lynn, if you can go ahead and put us into the breakout groups, we'll take 5 minutes to do that. Okay, well, welcome back, folks. So we're asking the question, what is your community, under this question of where are you, where am I? And so we're gonna put a poll up that you can respond to, and just give us a quick answer in that poll. Where are you? Are you rural, urban, suburban, or something else? Just tell me where you're at, and we'll get a feel for folks. I know not everybody's coming necessarily from rural, but.
Brad, I don't think anybody's back from the breakout
Not
rooms
everybody's
yet.
back yet. Okay, people are coming now. All right.
Yeah, I don't think they were ended. They were just given the opportunity to leave when they were ready.
Oh, okay.
Ours was ended.
Okay. I think all of you are back now. So if you haven't had a chance to click on your answer in that poll, we're asking, where are you at? Rural, urban, suburban, or something else? And, you know, I want to kind of curious what we see there, just to get a feel for where people understand themselves to be. Okay, and are we able to see, there we go. Okay, so pretty strong towards rural, 79% rural, some folks in urban, 9%, suburban, 6%, and then something else. It'd be interesting to do this poll at the end of our first hour together and kind of see where you all end up. Well, let me put the question to you in another way. we're talking about where am I? How do you understand rural? Like what is rural for you? And I want to frame the question this way. So we're going to use the chat function in Zoom, and you can just type in your answer. But what is rural? And here's what I want to do. Put the question this way: you might be rural if, and fill in that blank. You might be rural if. It's kind of like that a Jeff Foxworthy impression here, but you might be rural if, and I'll tell you mine. You might be rural if you get a Dollar General in your community and it changes your life. So I have talked to 2 rural pastors in completely different settings, and they said, we got a Dollar General and it changed my life. So what's yours? What you might be rural if what? Just drop that into chat. Yeah, you get a gas station. Oh, I love it. Schedule around milking, no stoplights, drive tractors. Ooh, smell rendering plants. Yeah, live in a town of less than 1,500, gets that number over there. Everybody knows your business. Yep. Town shuts down at 4 p.m. Yeah. Ooh, don't have internet. Yeah. Well, I love these. This is great. Thank you. You can kind of see some of these things. People are related, you know, the smell, the setting, what you experience when you're out on the road, right? There's something that speaks to rural. Yeah, some hard things too, opioid crisis, that sort of thing. But what does it mean to be rural? And, you know, rural has historically, and I mean deep history, like going back to like the Roman Empire, it's got this double ring to it, right? On the one hand, rural, it can be kind of seen as a backwater, right? They're all rural people, they're hicks in the middle of nowhere. Why would you want to go there? I mean, sort of demeaning rural. And on the other hand, sometimes our society really lifts rural up as like this paragon of virtue. They're salt of the earth people. That's where our food comes from. It's the, you know, it's really the backbone of the nation, the rural people. So it's kind of always had that double ring. Well, if you look at the numbers for what constitutes rural, you see a couple of different things. The first one is that I like to draw from is the US Census. And the US Census does a lot to kind of define what rural is. And they're of course the numbers people, they work over the numbers. But in their definition of rural, the US Census, the first thing that they say is this: according to the US Census, rural is defined as not urban. Now, they flesh it out a little bit more after that. In what ways is rural not urban, right? And why does that matter? So I want to get into that, but you know, we know that there's some kind of a difference, but what exactly is it? I was talking to an old timer here in Mound Ridge, and they have their family visiting them. You know, the kids live at all different corners of the country, and they had the daughter-in-law and her family from Los Angeles, right? The big city, and all the little grandkids were around the table, and they didn't have enough booster seats for all of those kids. And so the daughter-in-law from Los Angeles said, "Grandpa, I've got it, I know what to do. And we can just get a phone book and we can put it under this last kid that doesn't have a booster seat and we'll be all set." Well, so the granddad walks over, grabs the Mound Ridge, Kansas phone book and comes back and says, "Here you go." It's just a little sliver of a phone book. Here you go, there's your phone book. Well, you know, that's sort of rural, right? There's just not that many people here, right? And we'll get into that in a minute. But rural is not necessarily agrarian. It's not necessarily agricultural. Only about 6% of rural folks are involved in agriculture. When you look at the numbers nationwide, about 1% of folks who live in cities are involved in agriculture. Some of that urban agriculture is the exotic stuff, like doing hydroponics or growing lettuce on the roofs of buildings in Chicago, that sort of thing. But it's also people who live in smallish cities who are driving out to work on dairies or whatever, to work in rural communities. But you know, rural is not just defined by agriculture, even though that's one of the defining features. And if you think about that, if you're in a rural community, you know, is your life shaped around agriculture? It might be, but my guess is that for many of you, you're not involved in agriculture on a day-to-day basis. You know, would you know how to pull the calf, right? Or do you know how to drive a combine? Can you back up a trailer, right? So not everything that in rural is going to be the same as agricultural. Age-wise, there's some demographic differences. So nationwide, we see that the median age for rural is 51 versus 37 median age for urban. And that can really change the dynamic of a community. Of course, in our community, we've got a couple of wonderful retirement homes. It's part of, I think, our Mennonite heritage. Like a lot of these little rural communities in Kansas have a Mennonite retirement home. I'm guessing that's the same for some of the places you're at there in Ohio. And that means that we are a destination for people who are retiring or going into nursing homes. And that bumps the age of our community up. It's a tremendous source of wisdom and experience. But at the same time, people at a later stage in life have different priorities than younger couples who are trying to put kids through school. So we approved a multi-million-dollar school bond a couple of years ago. They took us 3 tries, right? It's just, you know, trying to kind of bring everybody along on that. So sometimes the demographics will mean that your community will have different priorities than maybe an urban center. Rural can also be surprisingly diverse. Now, it's true that many rural communities are white when we're talking about North America, so US and Canada, but there are also strong pockets of ethnic diversity. Of course, there's economic diversity. Rural is not the same. If you're talking rural New England or rural Midwest or rural Great Plains, right? You know, rural Texas, it can be quite different. And there's a lot of cultural diversity as well. And what I'm talking about always when we're talking rural today is really rural US and Canada. And of course, if we were talking rural Tanzania or rural, rural China or something like that, it would look quite different. Now, so the US Census, when the US Census talks about rural, so it's not urban, but when they get down to the nitty gritty, the US Census says that rural is 2,500 people or less with a population density of 1,000 folks per square mile. Now, this wouldn't be the only way to define rural, but this is one that I kind of like. The US Census would then also talk about urban clusters, which are 2,500 to 50,000, urbanized areas that are 50,000 plus, and then they've got some different categories like micropolitan, 10,000 to 50,000, or metropolitan, 50,000 plus. Another one would be the USDA, and they use a similar breakdown, but they've got it along a series of codes. You can look this up. They're called the Rural Urban Continuum Codes. And in that, one represents communities that are 1 million people or more, whereas 9 is completely rural. They use the 2,500 number as well. But there you can kind of get more of a breakdown. It's by county, and they have this for every county in the United States. That's 2 ways to think about this. A third way to think about rural would be to take what's called the social constructivist approach. And that's just kind of some fancy language that's used by sociologists to talk about how rural is really more like a culture or a worldview. And population is a piece of this. It's defined by the population, by relationship to the city, by nearness of neighbors. Agriculture plays into it, but it's really like a culture. Sociologist Robert Withnow, he calls rural a moral community. And when he says it's a moral community, he doesn't mean that rural places are moral, whereas the suburbs or cities are immoral. That is not what he's getting at. But he uses the language of moral community to indicate how rural communities have this common identity, which they understand themselves by. It's a moral identity, he would say. It's a group of people who are connected by ties of obligation, by ties of relationship. And I like to think about rural communities as places where people know one another and are known by each other, right? They know and know one another. And you might not really know everybody in your village, but you sort of sense that you do. You kind of have that feeling that you can at least place people on the family tree or have some sense of how they fit in. You go for a walk in a rural community and you expect to see somebody that you know. if there's a disaster like a house fire or something, you expect to help out that family. So there are formal responsibilities, there are contracts, there are job obligations in rural communities, just like there are in the cities and the suburbs. But I think what really sets rural apart is the way that people are bound together through relationships. And that's what gives rural communities their distinctive culture and character. And sometimes you'll hear people express this because they'll say things like, boy, I don't know half the kids on the basketball team anymore, right? They look at that roster of names on the basketball team, and they are not the same names as the ones that you see on the street signs of our community, right? There's names like Martinez, and they're not the names like Craybill and Durst that you see on the street sign. So it reflects a change in community, reflects some pride, but on the other hand, that sense that who we are is knowing each other. And so what does it mean if that begins to change? Now, I did a really quick, simple survey of Ohio Mennonite Conference. And when I looked at the online directory, I counted 46 total churches. I don't know if I'm getting this right, but 46 churches, 19 rural, then also 12 small town. So I came up with a total of 31 rural or small town for 67%. That was kind of close to what we had there on our survey, I think. I just want to say this too. Obviously, the culture of a place is not determined solely by population density, right? So rural, urban, suburban, those are only one way to slice this. And that might not always even be the most helpful way to think about where you're at. Culture has all sorts of different pieces to it that interact and overlap in complex ways. There's language and ethnicity, and there's faith, and there's the socioeconomic level of your community. That all plays into who you are. At the same time, we talk about culture, it's not just cultural production, right? So culture is not just symphonies and theater or TV or whatever. We all have a culture. Every place has a culture. And what we're asking when we ask these questions of where am I and what is my community is that culture seeking question, right? We're making it our business to understand something of how our local culture enacts itself. And part of the work and the calling of the church, I think, is to know well and to love well the culture where we find ourselves, the place and the people who are nearby. Now, this is at the same time too, there's not just like one rural culture, right? There's many rural cultures. Now, a couple of places that for me are helpful in figuring out where you're at. One would be what's called the ARDA, and you can search this up. It's the Association for Religion Data Archives. It's housed by Penn State. It's free. They will tell you something about the religious makeup of your county, and they talk about unclaimed population, which is kind of an interesting term, but people who are not claimed by another church, or they don't claim a church. And so it gives you a sense of where are people going to church or not. Another one that I think is helpful, that's the ARDA. Another one that I think is helpful is to look at, well, you can look at the community builder profile in there. Think about what's your sphere of influence, right? Where does your church touch? Another one I think is helpful is citydata.com. This seems to be geared more towards folks in the real estate industry, but you can get a quick sketch of housing info, what people are making, get tax info. It just kind of gives you some little graphics that I think are helpful. But those are just ways to gain information. It's the basic conviction that really matters here. And I'm convinced that place matters. And the late, great Eugene Peterson, one of my heroes, he wrote at one point that pastoral work is geographical as much as theological. And I'm convinced that what we need to do is to learn to cultivate the church in the place where we find ourselves. We need to have some understanding of the promise and the challenges faced by the people in the places where we are ministering. And in recent years, this I think is particularly important because we've been haunted by our society's dominant narrative of rural, which I would call the narrative of rural decline. And the narrative of rural decline is kind of like hillbilly elegy on steroids. And I don't know if you've read that book. I mean, now it's a TV series, and obviously J.D. Vance has got this big Ohio connection. I think, is he running for Senate or something there? But there's this. hillbilly elegy on steroids. And the idea is this, that everything is just fallen apart, like rusty pickup trucks out in rural areas, that everybody is just leaving, that everybody's addicted to opioids, that the economy is collapsing. That really holds out no hope for rural communities, the narrative of rural decline. There was an article in the New York Times that I ran across a couple of years ago, and it was this sort of breathless claim that vast swaths of the Great Plains, including Western Kansas, were being farmed and harvested by satellite-linked remote control harvesters. Now, I don't know if any of you have much experience with harvest, but at least in wheat harvest in Kansas, that is not something that you can do by remote control, right? It is all hands on deck. Like, that's when everybody comes home to help out. And so I would really love to see a satellite controlled remote control harvester. I don't know if there's one out there somewhere, but that doesn't feel like our experience here at all. But what it does feel like is kind of one more iteration of this sense that the Midwest and the Great Plains are just flyover territory, right? So now you got to harvest them by remote control. I mean, I guess some guy sitting in an office with some joysticks down in downtown Manhattan or something, I don't know. But it's like flyover territory to the nth degree, because now you got to go there with drones. It's like Mars, right? Nobody lives there. But it's just kind of this strange idea that makes sense to people, right? That there's just nothing out there and there's nothing going on. But we're dealing with that. We're haunted by that. But the question is really to get into, well, what is our place? If it's not that, where exactly are there, right? What are we got to think about what our context maybe first off is not. So I said earlier, it's not just agriculture, right? Not everybody in a rural area is a farmer. And maybe we need to ask, what is our culture, our overlapping cultures in our community? How do people in our area see the world? What do they celebrate? What do they value? Garden City, which is it's bigger than rural. It's really a micropolitan community out in Western Kansas, about 27,000 people. So like I say, a little bigger, but they are tremendously diverse. They talk about 22 different languages being spoken in the school system. So if you can kind of imagine that. And the school principal said this. He says, my question for everybody is, what do they celebrate? And I really like that, right? Like, find that common ground. I was talking to a church planter in Ephraim, Utah. And if you think about Utah, right? Like, who are there a lot of in Utah? If you think about who's out in Utah, this is easier if you're all sitting in front of me. You can just yell it out, but.
Mormons.
Yeah, there's lots of Mormons, right, in Utah. It's historic Mormon territory. Well, so he had moved into Mormon territory in Ephraim, Utah. It's a small town, and he needed a job, so he started a painting business, and he also had a dream of starting a church. And what he would do, this was like not a front, he really was a painter. He'd go into people's houses and he'd be painting their walls, and then he'd just like strike up conversations with them about their life and about their faith. And one of the things that he said, that led to a Bible study, right? And then that Bible study led to a church that he planted there. And one of the things that he said, this planter in Ephraim, Utah, he said, look, if you come into a community like this, you got to know where you're going. You can't come in and devalue like Mormon family values. You can't talk smack on that. You got to come in and value the structure of the community, value the family religious systems, and then, build some bridges and then speak to people where they're at. So that's what he did, and it really kind of took off for him. But so what's your community? What do you value? What do people celebrate? Does your area perceive itself to be growing, to be declining, to be holding steady? In some rural areas, we need to be able to speak to a perceived sense of marginality and loss, right? Because there are some communities, not every place is declining, but there are some communities that have declined. What we've seen nationwide is that when you look on the whole, in absolute terms, rural areas have not experienced that much decline. But when you look at it proportionally, you see that you see that rural areas are not growing as quickly as urban or suburban areas. And you do have some pockets where rural communities are actively in decline. Now, my go-to example is Jewell County, Kansas, which is up in the central northern central northern county in Kansas, they lost half their population since 1970. Well, that's going to make you see your community on different terms than if you're living in a community where a lot of new people are moving in. Now, I think maybe we have, So just thinking about this a little bit, I'm wondering if we have gotten behind. I wonder if our first breakout session took a little bit longer than we thought, because I would like to keep moving through some of this. But I'm gonna, so have a little patience. We're trying to kind of figure out this Zoom format. But for me, when you move into looking at your rural community, there are two key disciplines that we need to learn to practice. They are noticing and naming. What we want to do is just give our communities the National Geographic treatment, right? Just go there and look around. What do we see that's amazing and beautiful? Especially important since so often rural communities have been undervalued, especially across the Midwest and the Great Plains. And I don't know if any of you have seen this. You can Google this as well. It's the Natural Amenities Index. It's put out by the USDA. And what they did was rank every single county in the United States based on its natural beauty. And they were able to assign numbers to like every possible feature. So if you've got mountains over a certain height, like you get like a 7. If you've got so many, miles of open water, then you get another 7, right? So they tally this up, and using this scale, they're able to assign a scale for whatever county you happen to be living in, and then they color code this. And on this scale, according to the USDA, I try to kind of imagine like some guy sitting down in a cubicle in like the basement of this building in Washington, DC doing this work. But on this scale, what they're doing is ranking every county, and you want to be dark green. That means that you live in a really beautiful place. And a lot of places that are really beloved to me fall in the kind of orange and yellow areas, right there in the middle. And Ohio is looking pretty orange, but just kind of speaks to the way that there's so many tendencies to want to devalue our places. But it's like, boy, I think I mentioned this to somebody, and they're like, well, I think they didn't take into consideration clouds, right? So I mean, it's like, what do we notice? What do we value? I think that's the first thing. Are we able to show up and notice what is beautiful, both natural beauty and moral beauty? One of the place where I think we see this done so beautifully is in Acts chapter 17, where the Apostle Paul shows up in Athens, right? He's got a little time on his hands, so he wanders around the city and shows up on Mars Hill. And Luke, the writer of the book of Acts, says that Paul is very distressed by all of the idols that he sees, right? He's a follower of Jesus, classically trained in the Jewish scriptures, a Pharisee of Pharisees. So he sees all these idols and he's very distressed. But when he has a chance to speak to some of the folks from that area, the philosophers on Mars Hill, he doesn't say to them, "What are you doing with all these idols? This is terrible. I hate this place," right? He doesn't say that. Paul comes up to them and he says, "I see you are very religious," right? And then he talks about Jesus. And so he finds something that he can affirm, something that's beloved and beautiful. So this is noticing, right? It's not just a strategic thing, but it's actually an act of love. It's entering into and noticing the genius of a rural community, and rural communities have their own genius, just as urban and suburban places do, noticing the distinctive cultural geography of a place. Two concepts that are important for rural. One, the Gemeinschaft. Now, these are loan words from German sociology, and they're in some ways too simplistic, but I kind of like them. The Gemeinschaft is used to talk about a community that's structured and regulated by trust relationships and social boundaries. So Gemeinschaft, this is supposed to be kind of like a rural community. But a Gesellschaft is a community that is structured and regulated by institution contracts and prescribed roles. Now, it's overly simplistic. Of course, in rural communities, we also have prescribed roles. We also have contracts, right? And of course, in urban settings, there are deep connections, especially like in blocks where people have lived for generations. So it's oversimplified, but it kind of gives you a quick way to think about the difference between rural and urban, right? And I think especially important is that in rural settings, we have to learn the community structure, to think about the ins and outs of our particular culture, right? The way that people are interrelated, the way that we are known and knowable, the things that are prized, like people talk about prizing safety in rural communities, rootedness, that interdependence, that solidarity, the things that make us rural, it's the Gemeinschaft, right? All those informal connections. And I think that kind of gets us a little way down the road to thinking about what rural is. There's a lot that operates on trust in rural communities. I think that would be a little different from urban and suburban. Not that people in urban or suburban areas are untrustworthy, but you're just dealing with more people. You can't have the same level of trust. We go into our local hardware store and people just like hold up the box of screws and they're like, put this on my tab, right? And they just walk out. Or throw a 2x4 in the back of the pickup and they're like, put that on my tab, right? You just got it. When we get our oil changed, I leave the car out front of our house with the keys and the ignition, and the mechanic drives down, picks up the car, takes it over, gets it oil changed, brings it back. A couple of years ago, my wife and sons were traveling and I was doing my usual rush thing. Got the car back. I went and got some groceries, and then I went and got the oil changed. That or left the car out front to get it changed, and I ran to my office to do something. And later off, I come back in my house and I walk inside, open up the refrigerator, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, something seems really strange here. The milk is in a place that I never ever put the milk. It's just me. And I had a question about the oil change, so I call up the mechanic, and the lady on the other end, she says, "Did they tell you about the milk?" And I say, "No, tell me about the milk." She says, "Well, when you left your car for us, the mechanic noticed that you had left some milk in the back seat. Knocked on the door, nobody was there, so he went inside and put it in your refrigerator for you." So I said, "Thank you." That wouldn't fly in an urban area, right? But so there's this sense of trust, this sense that, well, everybody knows everybody. We can trust each other. Of course, it's got a flip side. It's got a dark side, right? Sometimes it can be hard to share about our weaknesses, right? Rural communities have a long memory. And there's also a desire to protect that blockchain of memory, right? So there's sometimes powerful forces that want to sweep things under the rug so that it doesn't become known, because no one will ever live it down. Well, I want to respect our time. So, here we are just thinking a little bit about what rural is. And I talked to a couple of church planters, Jim and Tina Von Wald. They're in a small town in Foley, Minnesota. And they planted a church there, a decade or so ago. When they came to town, Foley, Minnesota, there were 4 churches. You can kind of guess, it's like stereotypical Minnesota, what the churches were. But there was a Lutheran church, there was another Lutheran church, and there was a Catholic church, and there was a Presbyterian church. And they came in, they're Assemblies of God, Pentecostal folks, and they came in and started looking about to plant a Pentecostal expression of church in Foley, Minnesota. And Jim talks about how at one point, one of the old timers came up to him and said, what in the F do we need another church for in this town, right? There was a lot of resistance, but what they discovered, that was in fact their community structure didn't really connect everyone in the way maybe people thought. And what they were able to do is kind of draw a little jag on the community structure, create some space in that Gemeinschaft for folks that didn't really have a home within the established structure of their community. Their church has grown quite rapidly. They do some things that are kind of unique for the Assemblies of God. They have First Communion, they have confirmation, sort of speaking to the culture that they're in. But they've become a home for a lot of people that didn't have a place. And I think it really is because they came in and listened to their culture and were able to spend some time trying to kind of learn their culture. All right, so I'm going to just check in here. Maybe Alyssa or Lynn, if somebody can give me some advice on this. But my understanding is that we should be in the question and answer session now. And I was going to plan a second breakout, but maybe we need to not do the second breakout and just move to question and answer. Is that right? Am I looking at the time correctly?
Well,
Okay.
well, there is flexibility to work with what um, you feel is best at this time. So we could move right into question and answer, like you said, and take out the other breakout. There was a scheduled break, a 5-minute break from 7:40 to 7:45. Would you like to push that till later, or would you like to have that break and then come back with a question and answer? Do you have a preference?
Well, why don't we just move straight into the question and answer? We'll forgo the breakout session and move
Okay.
into question and answer. And then we can just pause and take that break. So
Great.
let's
Perfect.
just do that now. You can raise your hand if you know how to raise your hand, or you can just type questions straight into the chat, or you can unmute and just talk.
Hi, this is Louisa Erb. And as you were talking, I just kept thinking about, at least in this area, the changing nature of our communities in terms of how of people coming in that have not grown up in the area, people, and I mean, I'm a person that came in over 30 years ago, and I'm still at times not part of the community. You know, I'm sure other people can identify with that. You know, kind of, I don't address the standpoint of longstanding families and that. And then, of course, in our area, well, I guess that would be similar to Utah, the large Amish population too, and what effect that has. But I just kept thinking in the back of my head, the changing nature of rural areas and what is happening today. You know, the corner stores aren't there anymore. Dollar Generals. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, this is Joel Shank. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm an urbanite, pastor at Toledo Mennonite Church. But I read Wendell Berry, and like Wendell Berry, and you quoted him earlier, and in one of his writings, he talks about that there was a shift in freedom for some people. That freedom shifted from the ability to do things to the ability to buy things, right? And so if you could do a lot of things, you could be free, right? You could do for yourself, and you could, you know, you might not have a wealthy lifestyle, but you would have a sort of a free lifestyle. And then that shifted to like, well, you're considered free and you have options in life if you can buy things. And I've been reflecting a lot on, as we get more and more technological, more and more professionalized, to what degree do we lose some of the what we might consider to be rural skills? Or maybe they're not even just rural skills, but just skills for life, whether that be farming, whether that be carpentry, whether it be just some of the maintenance kinds of things, or the essential kind of things that life depends on. And I wonder to what degree, like you mentioned that New York Times article that talked about the automation of farming, and like, you know, there's this one single combine that's doing all the work or whatever. And that's interesting that you're saying that that's not taking place. But like, to what degree do you think that that is a significant factor that we should pay attention to in both rural and urban contexts? That we're not just consumers, but we have the ability to like produce.
Right.
I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great observation, great question. Well, I mean, I think in one way, like I kind of hear a part of the background there, like this ongoing phenomenon. This is a 100-year-old phenomenon, right? Of consolidation of agriculture into less and less hands. And I'm not sure which fuels which, if it's that you have bigger farmers buying up more land, or it's just that you have the kids moved away and they want to sell the land. So that's what happens. Who's left holding the land and farming the land? So that's certainly happening. And so in that way, yeah, you have fewer machines out there and fewer individuals working some of those areas. But then, like, yeah, this idea of this idea of losing the ability to produce for yourselves, and it just strikes me as that would be a common challenge, across rural and urban, and and I think about like how in our rural communities, like we really rely on one another to do things. How sometimes part of the beauty of living in a community like the one we live in now is that, for instance, our hardware store, like they know everybody's water heater and heating and cooling system like inside out, right? Like they've totally got you covered. And if you have a big water leak on Sunday morning early, like somebody's still going to come and be there to help you out with that. And so that wouldn't be the case in every place that's rural, and I don't want to idealize that, but I think there's kind of a depth of skills that does go along with that. That community, that idea of like we have to all just be, pulling for each other in a rural community, because like this is who we are. Like especially when you're in a very isolated rural community, like there are places where people are driving an hour or 2 hours to get to the Walmart or whatever, and there's just not anybody else out here but us, and so we've got to be able to take care of ourselves and stock up. So that there'd be gradations of that, because some rural communities, yeah, you're in a small town, but you jump on the interstate and you're in Wichita or whatever in 45 minutes, and not as big of a deal. But yeah, so I mean, I think there is kind of a sense of, there's at least a perceived sense of self-reliance, and there's a sense of solidarity and relying on each other's skills. And yeah, are we losing that? Probably. That's probably part of the risk. And I like that question. I want to sit with that a little bit more, maybe, but I think that you're raising some issues that are really important. I see, and there's a question there from Dan Hooley I see in the chat too. What have you observed about the digital divide? Yeah, I mean, this is classic, right? Internet availability tends to not be as strong in rural communities. The Center for Rural Affairs out of Nebraska has really been working on this and calling for a move from the federal government, something like rural electrification a century ago, to get broadband internet to everybody in rural communities. On the other hand, there are a lot of rural communities that have it pretty good. I mean, we have some high-speed fiber here in our community, and that has really positioned us to have people working from home, using Amazon, using whatever. And I think especially during the pandemic, you have seen a movement of people out of large urban areas. And I'm hearing this across the board, not just in like the Great Plains, but you have seen a movement of people out of densely packed urban areas to more small towns and rural communities that have that good internet access and have good road connections. And people are working from home, and schools are open in a lot of our rural communities. And so, you get out of the big city. So it's really a mixed bag, but there certainly tends to be less high-speed internet available in a lot of rural communities. Well, maybe let's pause. Can we do 5 minutes to just get turned around here, and then we'll dive into our second piece. And if you're still holding a question, feel free to drop that into chat, or you can maybe bring it along at our next question session.
Thank you, Brad. We'll see you all back here at 7:55.
Okay, everybody, welcome back after the break. We're going to go ahead and dive into this second section. And our focal passage for this weekend is from John 1. And when those two disciples of John the Baptist start following after Jesus, he turns to them and says, "What are you looking for?" Right? And the second thing the first thing that they ask, the second statement there is, Rabbi, where are you staying? And that might seem like kind of a strange question if you think about that a little bit, right? Rabbi, where are you staying? But the Gospels always choose their words very wisely. And so the word for stay there, or remain, is this word meno, and it means abide. It's kind of a great biblical word. Jesus uses that in John chapter 15, where he says, abide in me as I abide in the Father, right? So it's got this deeper sense. They're asking not just what his current address is, but where they're asking him about abiding, right? It's this whole resonance with his social location, with the people and place that he has chosen to be present to. It's about his identity, who he is, and what he is all about. Where are you staying? And I love Jesus. I love Jesus' response. It's very invitational, right? He says, come and see. And so they do, and they remain with him in that day. It's their first foray into abiding. And the question, I think, for this session is, how do we abide with Jesus in the rural church? And the way I want to kind of get at that question is by thinking about doing more and doing less. And we're still holding over that question from our first session. First, we asked, where am I? And now we're really thinking about, what am I supposed to do here, right? And maybe, okay, how much of it am I supposed to do? So the question really is, what am I doing here? Rabbi, where are you staying, right? What am I supposed to do here? Now, rural churches, especially small rural churches, can often struggle with how much to do, right? They have a deep history in the community, often deeply ingrained patterns of doing things, traditional sorts of involvements, like, there's an annual community celebration and your church has its role that it does every year. We've got this chalupa meal, whatever a chalupa is, but we've got a chalupa meal that we do every year at our church, and that's like our thing. And sometimes small rural churches can overfunction, right? Especially if they've experienced some decline. So they're still running all the classic ministries, but they're doing it with less people. So everybody's on 5 committees, right? Tell me if this sounds familiar. But sometimes they can also do too little, right? Even kind of become apathetic. The building needs work. It's kind of falling apart, but people just stop noticing the clutter or the decay. And I think pastors especially can struggle with this. More, do I do more? Do I do less? Because ministry is really flexible, right? You're not punching a time card. You can, if you go get coffee at the grocery store with the old guys, that's ministry. If you're volunteering at the school, that's ministry. If you go to a basketball game, potentially that's ministry, right? So with all that freedom, it's like, well, what am I supposed to be doing? And that's like, for me, this is the question always at the beginning of the week, right? It's before I start into the flurry of writing and preparation for Sunday. It's like, what am I supposed to be doing? Because ministry is a very funny profession. If it even can be called a profession, it's really more of a way of life. You unlock your office door and you plunk down in front of that computer and the whole world is your oyster. Now what? And I think one of the ways that we address this in the rural church, and especially in rural ministry, is by learning the two-edged arts of doing more and doing less for Christ. Okay, so this is the tension that I want to talk about, right? What are we supposed to be doing here? Well, more and less. We do more and less for Christ. And I think it's especially salient in the rural church. There's some special temptations and risks that we can fall into in the rural church. Now, a guy named Dwight Sandos, he is a professor at Trinity Bible College in Ellendale, North Dakota. And one time I was talking to him, they've got a rural ministry program there. And one time I was talking to him and Dwight said, there's 2 things that can happen, 2 ruts that we can get into in rural ministry. One is doing too much, one is doing too little. And that kind of got my wheels turning. And I have sort of been riffing on that observation and kind of developing it a little bit. I was going to have you go into a breakout session, but we gotta keep this thing boogieing along. So we're going to skip this breakout session, but just, reflect on this and maybe afterwards reflect, is this an issue for you? Do you find yourself doing too much or doing too little? But the challenge is that I want to come at this challenge by bringing 2 treasures from the great church tradition to this question. I'm going to bring two treasures, two theological concepts from totally different ends of the spectrum. One from the Jesuits and another one from the Anabaptists, right, from our people. And we're going to kind of develop this mongrel theology of rural ministry. And what I think we can do with this is avoid maybe some of the excesses of doing too much or doing too little, and kind of get into a healthy groove of doing more and less for Christ. And to ground this, I want to go back to the Gospel of John, but we're going to skip to the end to John 21, 15 to 19. You know, this is after Jesus' resurrection, and the disciples go fishing. And it says this: when they go fishing, they see Jesus on the side of they see him on the shore, and they haven't caught any fish, but he tells them to throw out their net again, right? And they catch all of these fish, and then Jesus invites them to breakfast. And here's the dialogue. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He, that's Peter, said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Truly, very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and will take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After he said this to him, he said, "Follow me." And what strikes me about this passage, I mean, this is really a foundational passage for ministry, because Jesus encounters Peter and he tells him three times, right? Feed my lambs, tend his sheep, feed my sheep. And here we are 2 millennia later, following this encounter, walking in Peter's footsteps, still living out this command. Here we are, just like Peter and the disciples. We're fed by Jesus, but then we're sent to feed his flock and to tend his flock. And I want to focus on the questions that are in here, because I think that kind of gets us into our discussion of more, right? Because Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" Right? And there's this more than. It's loving Jesus what? More than other people. Loving Jesus more than places and things. It's the simple more of maybe finding his heart kindled more and more with a love for Jesus, right? Like Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians, the love of Christ urges me on. And I think that Peter's reaction to the risen Christ on the seashore, it really demonstrates the more of love for Christ. He and the other disciples had been fishing all night with nothing to show for it. When Peter sees Jesus on the beach, he kind of awkwardly puts on his outer garment and he jumps into the water to be the first one to reach the Lord. And then, he single-handedly pulls in all of those fish. A minute ago, all of the disciples together could not get that net with those fish into the boat, but Peter does it by himself. He just grabs that net. It's a spirit-pumped feat of strength, this more that is not unlike the gospel more that will send Peter out on the road to spread the good news and end up in Rome and upside down martyrdom. But it's this feat of strength, this more. And for all Peter's love-fueled strength, he could only they only had that catch of fish because of Jesus, right? Apart from me, you can do nothing. And in this way, I think even while we're talking about more, at the same time, we're talking about less, right? There's this more and less built into this passage. And I want to talk first about more. So Jesus calls Peter to love him more. And there was a grid that I gave you, and I'm going to drop the link for that grid into the chat box if you're interested in following up on this. You can also find the grid in the introductory packet that was sent out. But if you want to follow along, this could be helpful. Let's talk about doing more. So Jesus says, do you love me more than these, right? It's this call. And I'm getting this idea of more from, I'm really developing it out of the theology of Ignatius of Loyola, right? And his question in his spiritual exercises, his Jesuit spirituality, this is the question. He says, what more can I do for the love of Jesus, right? And Ignatius of Loyola asks in his spiritual exercises that question. Ignatius is an interesting guy, right? So he was a 16th century soldier, womanizer, hothead, and he lost an argument with the cannonball and ended up in a hospital in Spain. And, you know, there wasn't much to do there for a guy like Ignatius. He was seeing, like, you know, the crucifix on the wall, and all he had for reading material were lives of the saints. Well, he starts to think about his life, and that really becomes a conversion moment for Ignatius. It turns his life around, and he gets out of the hospital and completely abandons his previous course, and really goes around Europe teaching what he calls his spiritual exercises. And this is really key, this concept of more, what's called in Ignatius spirituality, the magis in Latin, right? The concept of more. Now, I don't know if you've had much experience with Jesuits. I've had really great experiences. You know, when I was a young New Testament grad student in Boston, I didn't know a soul, and had this Salvadorian Jesuit who I met in Greek class kind of take me under his wing. We used to study Greek together in Spanish, which totally crosses all your wires, but he kind of took me under his wing and maybe saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. But he would invite me to eat with the Jesuit brothers and to, you know, just to do things together with him. And when my now wife arrived in the United States and we were on track to get married, he borrowed the local Jesuit order's car, and we drove to pick her up from the airport. And we were both so nervous, and I don't know if you've been through Logan Airport in Boston, but it's confusing. We were both so nervous that we kept driving around and around. We kept missing the proper gate, and we finally got her. The airport didn't ever fall down. But so I've had a great experience with Jesuits, and this is a key concept for them, the idea of the magis, right? It's this holy itch, this holy ambition, this kind of positive unsettledness. What more can I do for the love of Christ? And it really brings a zeal. One man talks about it and says that it's the idea of Ignatius's spiritual exercises is really to tap into a zeal that impels us to more knowledge, more love, more service of God and others. So it's doing everything that we can to give God more glory, to bring position our souls for salvation. The focus in the magis is really God. It's not on ourselves. And when I think about that, you know, it's kind of the missionary mindset. It's about going out. It's very extroverted. You build relationships. It's evangelizing. This is where the apostolic edge is at. You know, in leadership, this is energizing people, organizing, carrying out new initiatives. And I think, I don't know, post-COVID, especially for those of you in the Mennonite world, like this is a moment that's going to require the magis. It requires more from us, right? I mean, we need a little bit of holy ambition that kind of sits sideways with the obviously faltering status quo, right? We need to embrace the more of bringing our very best intelligence and hard work and creativity as an offering to God, right? And the more, get this, it cannot be feigned. It cannot be forced. You cannot generate more with caffeine. I have tried that, but the more arises, as it did for Peter, out of a heartfelt love of Jesus and a desire to be wherever Jesus is, doing whatever Jesus is doing, right? More. Now, I talked to a guy named Joshua Manning in Noel, Missouri. It's a tiny little community, about 1,800 people. He's a Southern Baptist, and they've got their community a number of years ago got a Tyson meat processing plant. Well, this poultry plant, that totally changed the composition of the community. It really shifted dramatically as immigrant folks came to work there. So the church that he came to serve, their church building has got 5 different congregations meeting in that building. So they have 2 Spanish-speaking congregations. They have 1 Chuukese congregation. I had to look that up, from the Marshall Islands. They have a Karen congregation, which is the one that he primarily works with. And then some white folks that have moved into the community specifically to work with discipling others. And even with all that diversity, that is not even the end of it. Their community has, he said, at least 5 more language ethnic groups that have not been reached. So there's Somali folks, Sudanese folks. And he said this, look, COVID has created a spiritual hunger that was not there before. It came through their town hard, and there were a lot of people that got deeply sick or lost their lives, but there's a hunger there now. He said in the Marshall Islands service, that Chuukese service, they baptized 25 people. There were 6 weddings, and then 2 weeks later, they baptized 12 more people, and they've only got like 10 Bibles in Chuukese, but and they're all trying to do this Bible study. But he said that they're getting more Bibles on the way. But what he does, he said, look, we are extremely relevant to our community. And for me, he said this, it's all about balancing. It's about balancing how many good things you can do and not grow crazy and not losing this core principle of preaching the gospel to all nations. So I think that ought to be painted on one of those inspirational signs, right? It's like, how many good things can you do without going crazy, right? Well, that's the more. Right? Like to just live into that, be like, this moment calls for more from us. How do we engage it? Now there's some risks to this, and you're going to guess what these risks are. This is me kind of curbing your enthusiasm, but one risk is burnout, right? This idea of magis or more, it's kind of an elusive word, and it can become a kind of caffeinated focus on doing, and go until we just can't go anymore, right? And there are certain personalities that are at risk for this, and so we have to be careful of burnout. We got to build into the concept of more sustainability, because we can burn out our congregation as well. That's sort of like burnout writ large. There's boom bust cycles, like North Dakota. This is pretty famous, but like Watford City went from a community of 1,700 folks, right there in the middle of rural, to 8,000 people within just a few years. They've got with the oil boom in North Dakota. And so you've got like man camps, maybe you've heard of this, that have sprung up as single men or men without their families have moved up there to work in the oil industry. Well, that changes the constitution of your community pretty quickly. It's not like Phoenix, Arizona type growth, right? It's going to look really different. So, how do you speak into that situation? How do you address people's desperate needs? I mean, how do you build community, right? It calls for something more. The leadership challenge here is what sometimes leadership folks talk about is turning up the heat, right? How can we turn up the heat just a little bit to just that precise level that will get people moving, bring people along, but not boil them and blow up the whole thing. Because churches can only take so much, individuals can only take so much, but how do we do more? And in rural communities, there's a high value placed on relationships. And so ministry, we've got to always watch it, because ministry is about doing more. It can't just be that, right? It can't just be that the pastor is like the visionary guy. He's like, and vision just means plans, right? Can't just be man with a plan, and usually is a man, but it can't just be man with a plan kind of leadership. It's got to also be about presence, right? Don't harm the Gemeinschaft. And so the way that I've seen people work at this, and that I've tried to work at this, is to be Pauline, right? Always encourage your church. Always have something that you can say that speaks highly of your congregation and your community, but also speak to loss, because there's a lot of communities that have experienced the kids all went off to college and they didn't come back, right? So speak to that. Help your congregation move from nostalgia to enthusiasm. For me, it's all about these little nudges, right? Just a little bit more, trying to keep people on board, help them to think about reaching out, help them to think about talking about their faith, help them to go just a little bit more to love Jesus more than all these other things. Is that doing anything for you? Is that resonating with you at all? All right, we're getting a few confirmations. Well, I'm just gonna keep on trucking then. Yeah. All right, this idea of more. So here's a couple ways this is channeled in our rural communities. We think about relationships. Think about more. How does this fit together? Well, for me, the key image is befriending. Now, there's different ways we could take this, but I will take it just two. One would be befriending the community. A second would be befriending individuals. And for me, befriending the community is about community engagement. I want to do a poll. How engaged do you see your church being in the life of your community? So if we could get that poll up there. If you're really engaged, that's a 5. If you're not very engaged at all, that's a 1. Where do you see yourself? So as we wait for those results yeah, exactly, pre-COVID, I don't know. Yeah, just do your best. Use your judgment on that. I know that we're still living in a different reality and we're about to enter a new reality yet, but how engaged are you? You know, rural communities so often fall under the sway of our society's disordered valuations that privilege what is big and fast and often urban and disparage what is small and remote and often rural. And I think we really see this every time there is a pastoral transition, because the question that always crops up in rural churches is, are we going to ever find anybody else, right? Is anybody ever going to come out here again, or is that the end for us? A couple years ago, I had some relatives visiting from the city, and we were driving through Kansas, you know, wheat fields as far as the eye could see, and my relative looks over and goes, "Wow, we are really in the middle of nowhere." And I borrowed a line that I had heard from somebody else, and maybe this is a little bit over the top, but I said, well, it's somewhere to us, right? I mean, I know this may be too much, but I think we got to have this idea that rural places are somewhere to the people who live there. They're somewhere to God. All right, how engaged do you see your church being in the life of the community? It looks like kind of in the middle. People were very humble and modest and just went for like the 3 and the 4 right there. So, you know, maybe there'd be a little bit of space to kind of up our game on that one, but let's think about that. I think friendship with rural communities, with rural places, I think that friendship is really a countersign to our society's dominant value systems. It reminds us of Christ's commitment to be among all people everywhere. So Paul talks about this in Galatians 6:10. Paul says, whenever we have an opportunity, let us work for the good of all, and especially for those of the family of faith. Now this term, the theological term for befriending the community, is solidarity. It's not, which means not weighing people based on how useful they are to our ministry or whether they're going to come to our church, but just connecting with them as human beings because they are human beings. You know, it's seeing the good of the church as bound up with the good of the whole community, because the reality is that you cannot have one without the other. There is no thriving rural church without a thriving rural community. And really just deploying our energy and resources in that direction. I talked to a pastor who described how his town of 800 people, that he said they used to have a movie theater. It went under, you know, in the age of Netflix. And so the town did not have that movie theater anymore, but a group of people banded together in this you know, town of 800 people. And they decided to restart the movie theater as a nonprofit. And the pastor told me how he's got a role in this nonprofit. He's been trained to do a couple of things. He puts up the new movie posters, and they just show, like, you know, new movies. It's not just Christian movies or something. He puts up the new movie posters. He sells tickets, and this pastor also told me that he has been trained on the popcorn machine. And you know, that kind of community involvement is not going to necessarily lead directly to faith interactions. I mean, I guess there could be like this moment where you're the pastor and you're like handing somebody their popcorn and you're like squirting that liquid heart attack palm oil butter all over that popcorn. You could be like, here, Jesus loves you, right? But really it's not going to lead to direct discipleship moments. But what it does do is tend to the overall life of the community, right? It's befriending the community. You know, and I told you it's not going to be like 10 points to make your rural church thrive, but if there is a key to success in rural communities, I really think this is one of them. I think thriving rural congregations are ones that are deeply involved and I'm scared to use this word, but relevant to their communities. We'll come back to this tomorrow night when we talk about evangelism. We're going to also bring this up in the sermon on Saturday morning, so stay tuned. Befriending your community. We also talk about befriending individuals, and got to be a little bit careful. When we talk about friendship, what I really just mean is valuing people and seeing them as folks who have something to bring to the table, right? Like you being in an equal relationship. Not every person we connect to is going to be an intimate friend with us, and we can't always share the details of our lives with just everyone, but it's seeing people just as human beings and connected to them as human beings. Now, friendships, I think, are really important. They help us value people and value the ins and outs of a rural community because relationships are so important. So when we moved here to Kansas, I learned a new term, and the term is this: double first cousins. So don't know if you bumped into that, but double first cousins, it's all good, right? It would be like two sisters, marry two brothers or something like that. So then the kids are double first cousins. They're related on both sides. Well, it just kind of points to this idea that people are really interrelated. And we befriend individuals. We learn to fit into that structure of relationships. And rural communities put a premium on knowing and being known. And so befriending is just taking time to be with people and build trust, right? And you gotta do that. You gotta be authentic, right? You gotta be authentic. It can't just be like trying to talk to them just because you want to get them in the door. Like our family, we've got this thing, like we used to do this more. Now we've got this 2-year-old, so we're just like trying to get enough sleep. But we used to really be good at watching for moving vans, right? And you see a moving van, you try to talk to people. We saw a moving truck on the other end of town a couple years back, and we went over there. We had a plate of cookies and like a little church postcard, and we knock on the door, and the couple was super friendly and invited us in, and we're sitting there and we're just talking about life, and it was really great. And all of a sudden the lady of the family just freezes and goes, "Wait, you didn't just come here to invite us to your church, did you?" And I was, busted. But this just moment like that, I think those people can detect that a mile away, right? Are we authentic? Are we really just connecting with them to invite them to our church, or are we connecting to them because we care about who they are, right? I talked to an older man in a rural community in Nebraska, and he told me how his pastor asked him to pick up a couple of teens and bring them to the youth group, and they were from a neighboring community. So he started doing that. And these were teens that were coming from, I don't know, maybe a little bit of a tough situation in their family life. And he saw them as his project. He was like, I am just going to really help these kids make better decisions. And so he would take them out to eat on Sunday afternoons, and they like eat fast food. They talk about life. And he felt like he was trying to impart these life lessons. He's this older guy, and he felt like it wasn't going anywhere. And then he had this moment, this kind of epiphany where he decided what he really needs to do is just see them as his friends and stop trying to change them and pressure them. And the crazy thing was, he said that it was at that moment where he stopped trying to like impart life lessons and just be their friend, that he felt like he started to make progress and that things started to change in their lives. And he said this to me, he goes, it's crazy that they even like me, right? A couple of teenage kids who are learning how to drive and this older gentleman. But I said to him, no, it's not. You're their friend, right? This is what it is. Like, that's what people are looking for. Well, let's pause. Let's do a 5-minute breakout session. What are some ways that you have extended Jesus-shaped friendship to others and to your community? So just talk for a few minutes in your breakout group. Okay, welcome back, folks. We were talking about doing more, the Magus. Now let's talk about doing less for Christ. And for me, the image of doing less is a monk, right? If Magus is about going out, being an apostle, being a missionary, then less is about staying in, taking time to be with God in prayer and reflection. Don't know how you feel about monks. I also have really great experiences with monks. Last weekend was up at a monastery in Nebraska doing a prayer weekend. So it's just really powerful for me to have that time to also stay in, that time to be concentrated on prayer and just be completely focused on God. But when we talk about less, what we're really getting at is what Jesus said in John 15:5, right? Apart from me, you can do nothing. He is going to be the key. No matter whatever our efforts are, apart from me, you can do nothing. And for me, the key word in doing less is gelassenheit. And that is a really beloved Anabaptist spiritual quality that you no doubt have bumped into. It's this posture of yieldedness to God in all things, right? So gelassenheit is this spiritual concept. It's translated as yieldedness to God in self-defense and in possessions. Doesn't just belong to Anabaptist. Philosopher Martin Heidegger defines gelassenheit as the willingness or ability to let things be as they are. So to do less for Christ is to recognize that our work in the church, or for pastors or leaders, our ministry, is not merely the product of our own efforts. The church is this supernatural reality. It's forged along divine human lines as we take up our calling to do what Paul says and become fellow workers with God, right? And it turns out that we got to, in the end, we got to do what those bumper stickers have been telling us all along. We got to let go and let God. Now, there are practical reasons for this. Not least, just a recognition that what the church most needs is going to be beyond our capacity to produce because of the limitations of congregational dynamics, because of the limits of our own leadership capacities, but also because of the deep mystery of God's providence, right? Practicing less for Christ will mean returning through prayer to God as our strength. It's taking seriously that the work of the church is going to be spiritual before it is strategic, that many of the church's goals and goods are not trackable along earthly metrics. So less for Christ means recognizing that though we may struggle all night on the sea, it is God who fills the nets. Now, kind of the leadership principle that comes with this would be managing self, or maybe you could say knowing yourself. That's what allows us to do less. When we lived in Washington State, our community out there was largely Hispanic, and the congregation that called me out there, that was really part of the draw for us. We were going to go into this multicultural ministry in Washington State. That was my thing. I was like Mr. Multicultural. I spoke Spanish and lived in Peru, right? I was going to go do this multicultural ministry. I remember I was telling my seminary classmates about my call to ministry, and one of them was like, "Wow, that just fits you perfectly." And I was like, "Yeah, I know." So we packed up everything, got on the road, and launched our new life and our new ministry in the Pacific Northwest. We didn't know a soul. And this church that we were serving sponsored this little Spanish-speaking congregation that met on Sunday evenings, right? So I was just like, I'm going to be working with both of these. And here, a few scant months into our time in Washington, we just barely got our feet on the ground. I remember it very distinctly. I was eating our evening meal, and the pastor of the Spanish-speaking church called me up, and he said in so many words, "We're going back to Argentina. Good luck." And so there, I at that point found that I tried to do way too much. I tried to fix problems that were not mine to fix. I made a lot of mistakes, and I had to grow through some pretty trying situations. But one of the aspects of this that was most challenging for me was the sense that my whole reason for being there was to do this cross-cultural ministry. And now that little church was falling apart. And so my sense of calling, my sense of identity was wrapped up in going out there and doing this thing. It was my thing, right? I'd been called to this thing, and suddenly I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to do any of it. But God is at work in more ways than I knew. He used my gifts in ways that I could not have anticipated. And he led me to grow through that times in ways that I would not have chosen for myself. And after a bit of a course correction, God was still at work and was leading me and was involved in that church. But that was a moment where I should have just cooled my jets and done less, right? That was a moment where I needed to take a step back, where I needed to understand what my triggers were and not just rush in. Now, sometimes less is going to involve self-care, though that's not exactly the same thing. I'm a little bit hesitant about self-care. Yeah, it's important, but I think sometimes we experience burnout in ministry, and what we need to get ourselves out of that cannot be cured by watching TV or going on a hike. I mean, it really is going to come from doing the one thing needful. But sometimes it is self-care. There's some risks with less. One would be complacency. I was talking to some pastors in the Evangelical Covenant Church. It's really, I don't know if you know Evangelical Covenant churches, they're really thriving and planting a lot of churches. And one of them said, well, if we just kind of accept churches as they are and we do less, doesn't that mean giving up on transforming legacy churches? And I think in some ways he's right? I mean, sometimes we just accept churches as we are, we just love them where they're at, but that could mean the church dies, right? And the triumph of the church is guaranteed because the triumph of our Lord, not because of our hard work and our cleverness. But sometimes I think, yeah, there's going to be just that sense of we let things go, but there can be complacency that happens. And for me, the way around complacency is, what is our model, right? Are we modeling our work on this fast-growing suburb? Are we trying to do their thing in our place? That can really distort priorities. And I've seen this, right? It's like when people start baptizing folks who have already been baptized as adults because they want to make their numbers look good, right? Or, it can be perceived as being not good neighbors. Like a couple of years ago in our church, we had the bright idea, and one of our teams, this is my idea too, but had the bright idea to send out a mailer to every door in the church. That could be really great. But when we took that to our church council thought that was going to make us seem like we were trying to steal people from other congregations. We wouldn't seem like good neighbors, right? Right. And so, just kind of how do we maneuver in our own church, but at the same time, not become complacent, not to come off as like inauthentic tryhards, but in our rural places, sometimes that only are going to measure in triple digits, we've got to be really thoughtful about what our model is, right? Who are we trying to emulate? I think another risk, and this one's key, is acedia. I don't know if you've bumped into this word before. It's one of the 7 deadly sins. It's often translated as sloth, but acedia is not being lazy. A really great book that talks about acedia would be Kathleen Norris's Acedia and Me, which reflects on her experience in Lemon, South Dakota. But acedia in the ancient church, for monks who went out in the desert and really wanted to dedicate their lives to pray, was known as the noonday demon. And that comes from Psalm 91, the noonday demon. Acedia is, if it's a demon, it's kind of this gray blur. It's sort of a malignant dust bunny of a demon. Acedia is just this seeping feeling of blah, that nothing matters. And the reason acedia is a sin, as opposed to, say, depression, which could kind of look like acedia, but is really has to do with some other physiological factors. The reason acedia is a sin is because it is ultimately a failure to find our joy in God. And what acedia does is it makes us restless, makes us annoyed, makes us question whether anything that we do matters. And that's acedia. And I'll tell you, that is my deadly sin of choice, right? Especially on like Tuesday mornings, I'm kind of like, all right, what am I supposed to be doing here? Like what matters? And we conquer acedia through prayer, specifically contemplative prayer that helps us to see our context through God's eyes of love. And we're going to come back to that tomorrow night when we talk about prayer, which is really, really key. So that's less. Now I think at this point, like, where's this sitting with you? Do you have some questions? Do you have some thoughts on what we're talking about?
Brad, maybe just to grease the wheels here, I wonder, I've been reflecting recently on the importance of grace in receiving grace in order to spur on. There's that way in which, as we receive the Spirit of God, it's that paradoxical way in which it also propels us forward. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how grace connects with the Gelassenheit.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great connection. I mean, it's grace, grace, and grace all the way through. I mean, because we can do nothing without Christ, and I think it is both the realization of our own powerlessness to change the things that matter most, but at the same time, that life that springs from grace, the energy that springs from grace, that pushes us on to try and to be involved and to be connected, to kind of go out one more time and cast the nets again and see what comes out of the dark water. So yeah, I mean, that's part of why grace is such a powerful concept and why it's so mysterious, because it's both at once, both energizing and relinquishing, right? So I love that connection. Do churches tend toward one or the other more or less, or can they bounce back? And the two pendulums can those two pendulums end up being seasonal? Yeah, I suppose that there are some churches that maybe have it in their DNA to be more or less. I don't know. And I think sometimes I wonder, like, if this is like the denominational or historical traditions can tend to be more or less. I think maybe because Gelassenheit features so importantly in at least our assumed Anabaptist Mennonite theology, I think often that we can tend towards the less, not that we don't work hard, but that we can sometimes fail to kind of have that missional drive. And I don't hear this as a critique. I mean, I'm in the same boat, right? But I think it's this sense that we've got to be asking ourselves, what more can I do for the love of God? And what are ways that we can try something new in our communities? I mean, I just think there are hungry people in our communities, hungry for the word. And I really think, like, watching how well it has gone for like that Assemblies of God couple that moved into this little community, it's like, well, they're not doing anything heroic. They're just showing up and loving people and preaching the gospel. Like, we can do these things too, right? Like, we can get in there and do this too. Our churches can grow too. There's so much potential there. And so, yeah, I mean, so how do we get in? And I think there can be seasons. I mean, what we're getting is we do both of these at once, right? Like, we, in a I think a life that's really following Jesus, like, you're gonna be both centered in prayer and both energetically being out there, like, connecting with people as a church, maybe, right? And I think as an individual. And then I think sometimes churches, I'm hearing this word here, I think sometimes churches need to do less so that space can be created to do more. Yeah, I believe that. And stopping programs instead of continuing because we've always done church that way. Yeah, amen to that. I mean, sometimes we just got to give things up. And don't use the word failure. I think the word in our church this year, we're really engaging at West Zion in this kind of rethink of, like, who we are. It's like, look, this was really hard. It's been a hard 2 years for us as a church, honestly, but this has been really hard. And so we're kind of saying, all right, that's hard, but this is a moment where also some new things are possible as we're entering into this somewhat post-pandemic phase. And really looking at everything that we do, kind of recentering ourselves in Christ and in our mission. And the word that we've been using is experiment. That is our operative word. Like, everything is an experiment. And when you do an experiment, and I picked this up from Howard Wagler, who's a pastor near here, but when you do an experiment can't really fail, right? Like, you just try it and see what happens. And so I think that we got to do some experiments now and say, you know what, maybe this old program is not working anymore. Let's experiment and try something new. And if that doesn't work, we'll try another thing. Does Anabaptist theology limit our ability to minister with all in the community? Maybe we'll talk about this tomorrow. Yeah, I don't know, maybe we can bring that up tomorrow, but it potentially can. I mean, I think we just have to have this view. Well, first off, so everything I was saying about community structure and that idea of the Gemeinschaft, you know, churches are like mini structures and mini Gemeinschaft. And so, especially in the Mennonite world where there's so much like double first cousins and people that are interrelated, that can be a challenge in and of itself. You know, I've heard that from people. It's like, well, you know, I thought you were like, I'll change the names to protect the guilty, but I thought you were just like the Epioder church, so I couldn't go there, right? And so there is that piece of it. I think also our theology. I don't know. We have to have a theology that is Catholic with a little c, right? That sees a way that we can embrace everyone, right? That's universal. And so I think that in that sense, just that's not afraid to connect with people where they're at. You can't just enter into conversations to only connect with folks that are going to kind of agree with you up front. You have to be able to take some risks and connect with people that are going to come down differently on, you know, like military or whatever, and then just kind of find ways to work with them and create space within the church. Would you say theology or more traditional culture? Yeah, I mean, I think both. I mean, I think this is exactly where the challenge is for Mennonites, because Mennonite is like an ethnic group, but it's also a theology. And I think there's that structural issue with the ethnic group piece, the traditional culture, and then some theological challenges that maybe hold us back, just because we need to have kind of a more of a that missional vision that can engage everybody.
Some think that Geraldo Nunes here, Open Arms, a Hispanic ministry. What I've been seeing a lot, that we're keeping too much tradition in the church, like you said, the elders and all these, and we're not allowing people different of us to be part of the church, keeping these hymns, this 100% perfect timing, like when you go to other cultures, you see the difference, how everything works. I was in Bolivia right now, time, I like it, respect time, but it's like if you always try to do everything perfect, we're not allowing people that are different of us to be part of the church. I guess this is our failure right now. And for the reason, the rural church for us are dying, like you said. People are going to college, and they open their minds, all right? They open their minds, like they start to like the people that, maybe it's homosexual, and, they come with other ideas, and they don't fit in the church anymore. If they come back, they won't fit in the church, but usually they say, no, I cannot go, come back to Kidron. I won't fit there anymore.
Yeah.
I want to expound on that, because normally, I noticed you were talking about noticing and valuing, and we're also talking about like rural churches, and Geraldo mentioned about like different ethnic cultures. But right now, in the church that I'm at, Central Mennonite Church, we're in the midst of what COVID has done, as kind of put pressure on the community within the church. That has shown some stressors, kind of like brought that out. And it's more on the lines of generations. You have families that are wanting to commit to the church, and yet the traditional culture that the Mennonite church has doesn't speak to them, themselves, their children, the people they want to invite into the church. So we're not even talking about Hispanic cultures or anything like that. We're talking about their own children. And so that raises ideas of, do I even belong in this church? Should I go to another church? And we're dealing with those type of situations in a rural context. And so how do you, we're working on, me and my co-pastor I work with, we're working on issues like transitioning and things like that. So I think this is a really good conversation, but there's no but or however. I think it's a great conversation, yet we have to open our minds as to, valuing, noticing, and dealing with moving on, and to be able to respect the past. I mentioned the idea of having some are settlers and some are pioneers in the same church. And how do we work together in moving that church into the future? So.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ramon.
All right, are we ready to wrap up then? Thank you so much, Brad, for sharing your thoughts, your perspective, your wisdom with us this evening. We're excited to continue this on tomorrow night. We look forward to seeing everyone back here. It'll be the same Zoom link. We'll start at 6:30 tomorrow evening. The theme for session 3 will be Come and See, Rural Mission and Evangelism. And again, just thanks a lot, Brad. There's a lot of good food for thought. It's a conversation that I think a lot of us have been anxious for and then hopefully energized by tonight. I know I have been. So I just invite us to close with a word of prayer. Our God, we give you thanks this evening for how good you are to us, for all the ways that you are moving in our congregations, in our conference, outside our conference, through all the people present here. As we listen to Brad, as we share our thoughts in our breakout groups, in our Q&A sessions, as we receive your word and seek to go and live out the visions that you're inspiring in our hearts and in our minds. Lord, we pray that we would understand the spiritual task before us, that you are first and foremost calling us to receive your grace, receive your kingdom into our hearts, into our churches, and to let that move through us to be a blessing, not only to our churches, but to the communities that you've sent us to and planted us in. All right, pray for each person tonight that we would get a good night's sleep, have a good day tomorrow, and for Brad in particular, that you would give him the rest and the energy he needs to return and continue to bless us tomorrow evening. For all these things, we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right, have a good night, everyone.